Hey, y'all. This is Jonathan Martin, and I've written a new book called The Road Away from God. Comes out June 7th. It is a deeply personal book. Comes out of my own experience of walking alongside a lot of people who I think would number themselves among disillusioned and disenchanted disciples. It's also a really vulnerable book because it comes out of my own experience of being a disillusioned, disenchanted disciple. So I hope it speaks the language of your own soul. It's been a long time coming, certainly a labor of love. And I wanted to share an excerpt with you today that I've not shared publicly before. It's the portion of the book really that feels just still the most resonant in my own spirit right now. Hope it lands with you. But this is from a section of the book that's called The Moment of Recognition. As the sun sets behind them against the backdrop of the desert sky, the stranger sits. The men can feel the electricity of his presence, how the current of him fills the space between them. But the inexplicable sense of aliveness that pulses through them is not like being nervy and jangled. How is it that he can make every cell of their being feel called to attention, and yet be such a non-anxious, soothing presence? How can he feel so other and yet so impossibly familiar? The men set out on the road away from God, and now this little ramshackle roadside motel with tacky colors and musty scents feels like a home. They're still in the thick of the darkest days of their lives, yet somehow they feel at home within themselves. There's a bottle of wine open at the table, a basket of fresh bread in the middle, the faint howl of the desert wind behind them. There's nothing fancy about the meal, but the deep crimson wine looks decadent after a long day of walking. They've spent hours in lively conversation, so there are no words now exchanged as they pull up closer to the table, just soft smiles visible around the eyes, palpable gratitude for the moment unfolding before them. In a gesture of hospitality and deference toward their obviously wise and devout new friend, they ask the stranger to say a blessing in his own dialect. When the stranger picks up the bread, Cleopas feels a tempest rise in his own belly. There's something terribly familiar about the open way the man holds the bread, like a gift. The way he raises it over his head, tilting his chin back. The way the light from the candle hits his eyes as he looks towards heaven. The lilt of his accent in the poetry of the ancestors. In the prayer to the one who met Moses in the flaming bush, it's like the stranger is transported somewhere, like they are transported somewhere. It's like this meal is every meal, like it is the first Passover, the first Seder, like this bread is manna from heaven that fell from the sky just for them. Like this sweet wine was trampled and pressed out of their own crushing sorrows and served before them in the chalice. While still surrounded by grief on every side, the disciples hear the words of the prayer book crackle from their childhood. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Psalm 23:5. When the stranger finishes the blessing, he pauses. Feels like it's long enough for him to visit old Father Abraham's bosom and return to them. He looks at them knowingly and offers a little cheers with the glass. In the silence, Cleopas can hear his own heart beating like a drum, the only thing he can hear, as even the wind goes still as death. In the hush, the stranger breaks the bread. And when he tears the bread, he might as well have been tearing glass, because everything in the room shatters. He breaks the loaf, and he breaks something in them, like the last time around the table when he broke their hearts. A flicker of familiarity. They remember the exquisite tenderness with which those hands had touched the lepers and the little children, had touched their own longing. They remember how tenderly he handled the little boy's bag lunch, how those same callous hands broke it too, down into pieces, which became more pieces, and more pieces, and more pieces, and more pieces, until it felt like that one little boy's lunch could have fed every hungry mouth the world has ever known. And they remember when they saw his body torn in two, how that last time at the table it was just like this, right before they broke him down and broke him open and broke him into pieces, which became more pieces and more pieces and more pieces and more pieces. Oh God, they remember everything. Everything. As he reaches out his leathered hands to give them the bread, it all comes flooding back to them. As he's giving them the pieces of the bread, he's giving them pieces of themselves back. He's giving them their own memories back. They are remembering him, and they are being remembered. Everything in them is on fire with recognition. They know who he is. They know what this means. They know who they are. And in that burst of recognition in which everything converges, the ancient story, the Moses story, the story of their own trauma, the story of the past, the story of their future, then they know that what they thought was the road away from God was actually a collision course with God. It looked like they were simply walking away from the holy city, from their community, even from their tradition. It looked like, perhaps even to themselves, that they were simply on the wrong path. But God had walked with them all along on the road away from God, in a form they did not recognize. And the road they thought was going nowhere had been going somewhere all along, going here to communion. They thought that they had left the temple and the God they worshiped there. It turns out the temple had followed them home. Thanks so much for taking time to let me share this with you. Road Away from God comes out June 7th. Thanks again, friends.